Harriet Bergeron, written and read by Romanized Visigoth in homage to Harrison Bergeron by the late Kurt Vonnegut, Jr. The year was 2066, and humanity was finally diverse. Not the false diversity of ages past, nations clinging to patches of earth, a source of endless conflict. Not even the multi-ethnic countries, regions, or towns of the early diverse period. This too had been tried and found wanting. Very soon now, humanity would have complete diversity down to the individual level. Neodiversity, it was called. This triumph of progress was no mean feat, requiring unprecedented ingenuity and action by the United Nations Commission on Diversity and Inclusion. It was finally worked out with Directive 9, a global diversity breeding policy. After that, it was only a matter of time and enforcement. George Bergeron stepped out into a clammy April afternoon that seemed hesitant about spring. Around him sprawled architectural aspects from around the globe, familiar forms turned so original that they felt like an afterthought. Customary scents wafted up from food trucks: cassava fufu ramen, falafel sushi, curry poutine. As he walked, musics met him and receded: sitar and saxophone, powwow and prog rock, the new fusion culture in all of its glory. And best of all, the people, the faces of the city, the faces of the world, countless shades of brown in the eyes, hair, and skin, the palette of humanity. It could be Morocco, it could be Paris, it could be Tokyo or Chicago or Vita-le-Vue. Seeing the beautiful diversity before him, George wiped away a tear. The centerpiece of Directive 9, the breeding policy, worked like this. A scheduled algorithm maximizes genetic diversity in each generation, granting reproductive license for compatible partners. Compatibility is determined through high levels of DNA sequence mismatch, denoting racial distance, and is tweaked each generation towards the end goal of equal representation of all previous ethnic DNA clusters within each person. Dating and marriage were immediately affected, but within a short time, most people chose the convenient reproductive clinics. In vitro fertilization became the norm. Parenting was likewise simplified through universal public childcare. The whole business didn't have to burden one's social or work life. Some still did it the old-fashioned way. Eccentrics who, it was whispered, were sometimes found with cultural contraband. Even they would obtain a license, however, as unlicensed breeding held a capital punishment. George was just such an eccentric, or rather, his wife Harriet was. She had insisted on marriage and on taking his surname, both long out of fashion. She had a physical book collection that, while not illegal, raised many an eyebrow. She even wanted to have children the old-fashioned way. As far as George knew, peculiarities such as these were unique to Harriet and, though he may not admit it, contributed in large part to his attraction to her. Harriet's was a personality rarely encountered. Her DNA wasn't particularly diverse, a point of prestige rapidly fading in the face of neodiversity, but she had something else different about her. Now that he thought about it, most people George knew seemed more or less the same, interchangeable. Similar values, similar interests, all cultured and eclectic, of course, but consonant in texture. George wondered to himself whether Harriet's old-fashioned quirks were more in line with the spirit of diversity. He kept on wondering this right up to the clinic, where he was to apply for their joint reproductive license. The Commission on Neodiversity and Inclusion had been the Commission on Diversity and Inclusion before Directive 9. Directives 1 through 8 were resounding successes. On this, everyone agreed. And yet the problem of race persisted, the existence of races. Eventually, they realized that the old concept of diversity was inherently flawed. As long as distinct genetic clusters were permitted to exist, conflict would arise. The solution was neodiversity, where everyone is so thoroughly and irrevocably mixed as to abolish the very concepts of race or ethnicity, an end to tribalism through an end of tribe. Neodiversity had always been the way forward. Everyone could see that now. While filling out paperwork, George remembered an antique survey he had come across in a museum. It had boxes for African, Caucasian, Pacific Islander, etc. Those categories had been crumbling before Directive 9, as a result of earlier directives. Now, they were being ground into dust. Very quickly in the early diverse period, it became difficult to, with any sort of precision, keep track of one's ethnic makeup. This task was happily offloaded to the commission and subcontracted to clinics. Most people, without a report, didn't know their fractions of this or that. Fewer still seemed to care. I guess that's really the point of the whole thing, he thought to himself. George entered the apartment, glancing briefly at the bookshelf as he passed, and set a manila folder down on the kitchen table. He picked it up, put it down again. Just then, Harriet breezed in from the backyard, pecking him on the lips before popping a cherry tomato into his mouth. "First of the season," she said. George chewed. "I wish you'd get rid of those plants. They say homegrown food can be dangerous." "And what is that?" "A knife," said Harriet. "A paring knife. How else am I supposed to slice the tomatoes?" "You get them processed at the store like everyone else, not with a weapon," George solicited. "I showed you, remember? The automatic food processor in the produce section," he continued. "It's very convenient, but who knows if you're even allowed to use it with homegrown food. I guess that's nothing compared to having a knife in the house. Harriet, are you listening?" George asked. She wasn't listening. Her eyes had found the folder on the kitchen table. "Harriet," said George. She opened the folder and took out the contents. 1, 2 separate sheets of paper. George put his arm around her. "We knew we might not qualify for a joint license." Unmoving, she continued to stare at the papers, the slogan of the Commission on Neodiversity and Inclusion staring back at her. The way forward. "But what does it matter? Nothing's changed between us. Our life is the same as before." A couple weeks had passed, and Harriet was still not over being denied a joint reproductive license. "I told you that this was important to me," said Harriet, "that it had always been important to me, to have a family together. Our family, with our children, made from you and me." "What do you mean, ours?" George asked, confused. "People don't own their children, Harriet, not when you live in a society." Last year, George and Harriet went to Scotland on vacation. Harriet picked it because she knew that both she and George, coincidentally, had unusually high Scottish ancestry. This sort of thing was discouraged. There weren't rules against it, but it plainly contradicted the spirit of neodiversity to be interested in one's ancestors. "I absolutely love it here, George. Isn't it great?" asked Harriet. "Yes, it's very pretty," George answered. And it was pretty, misty fields padding drops and gaps between heather-stained hills. "But doesn't it feel special?" Harriet asked. "For me," she said, "it feels like going home." Harriet was looking towards the horizon, fingers combing the knee-high grasses. George followed her gaze out over the moors. "It's beautiful, but for my money, I'd take Bermuda this time of year," he quipped. Harriet looked up at him strangely, then smiled and said, "Well, I'm glad that I'm here with you." She kissed him on the cheek. "Let's go to that pub, the one that has the traditional Scottish food we heard about, the contraband place." "You don't have to ask me twice," said George, and hand in hand they went off together. "Harriet, what's all this?" George asked as he entered the apartment to find a studious Harriet nested in books and papers. "I'm reading," she said, head lowered in concentration. "I see," said George. He scanned the titles. "Bylaws on Diversity and Inclusion. Proceedings of the United Nations Symposium on Neodiversity. Recorded non-licensed births, 2055 to 2065. "Harriet," he asked, "are you even allowed to have these?" "Of course I am," she said, then added, "They're here, aren't they?" "What is it that you're looking for?" George asked. "Listen to this," Harriet said excitedly, opening a book to a rabbit-eared page. "It is estimated that anywhere from 250 to 1,000 unlicensed births occur each year, most of them off the grid." "Off the grid?" asked George. "And this," she leafed through a stack of papers. "In this very city, 3 years ago, a birth occurred to an unlicensed couple. The child is still alive, name not given." "How?" George asked. "Were they allowed to keep it?" "No," she said. "The mother died. Normally, an unlicensed pregnancy would be terminated, but due to the death of the mother, the fetus was extracted and incubated." She returned to her study. "Harriet," George entreated. "Rules, you know," she mumbled. "Harriet," George yelled. "What?" she snapped. "I have to at least look, George." Then, more quietly, "I have to try." "Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but don't you think that if it was as easy as finding a loophole in a book, That people would be getting around the rules all the time? He stopped. She wasn't listening. He watched her read for a while. I was thinking, George said to his shoes, why don't we meet with 2 of those breeding partners that we got from the clinic? Why don't we what? Harriet finally looked up at him, glaring. Just to meet them, to see what they're like, George said hastily. No pressure. George, Harriet said slowly, why would I meet them if I have no intention of doing it? I know you don't, said George. I know. But maybe you'll change your mind. I'm not saying it's likely, George quickly addressed, interrupting her pre-protest. All I'm asking is that you meet them. Please? For me? Harriet looked up at George, then back at her books. Okay, I'll meet them, she said. But I don't have to like them. There was a knock at the door. George turned to face Harriet. Ready? He asked. She nodded and forced a smile. Taking her hand, George opened the door. Hi, come in, George welcomed, leading their prospective partners quickly past the bookshelf and into the kitchen. One of Harriet's books had been left on the counter. The woman glanced coyly at it, but sat down without saying anything. They made their introductions. George and Harriet, Frank, and Denise. Where did you get those? Frank asked, eyeing the tomatoes atop the salad suspiciously. They look different from the ones I saw today at the store. George pretended that he hadn't heard. Make yourselves comfortable. So, Harriet, said Frank, turning his attention from tomatoes to grower, have you looked into breeding clinics? A friend of mine tried Gen Blend over in the East District. Harriet, with effort, replied, Oh, I haven't looked into it. George usually takes care of those sorts of things. Her gaze shifted distractedly to the window. George put his hand on her knee. Denise turned to Frank. Yes, I've heard great things. Their connections are excellent. One of my sister's children had to be transferred to a school in another zone after the new educational directives, and Gen Blend took care of everything. They're getting cultural enrichment requirements out of the way early, too. Conversation continued for some time in this vein, George chiming in edgewise between the newcomers, Harriet mostly silent. Abruptly, Harriet pushed back from the table. Excuse me, she said, and disappeared into the bedroom. Dinner limped on for another half an hour, everyone wondering if Harriet would return. When they finally left, on his way out, Frank tactfully asked for Harriet's medical records. Birth control was actually quite simple. All women were issued a contraceptive IUD, deactivated upon breeding license approval. Racial disparities in death rates presented the real design headaches. Absent this, neodiversity scheduling would have been much simpler. As it was, discounting future contributions from early deaths and differences in racial mean ages had been, at first, the most demanding aspects of implementation. Some would need to have fewer children to make up for the death rates in others. After a few generations, this issue worked itself out. Thankfully, the total population, in addition to those comprising it, was under control. A core principle of the Commission was that, with enough operational latitude, any obstacle could be dealt with. Harriet had, unsurprisingly, been out of sorts since the meeting. George wanted to cheer her up, but was not very practiced in this particular aspect of relationships. Heretofore, Harriet had possessed a relentless good cheer. Another vacation? Back to Scotland? Perhaps they needed a big change, like moving. As he entered the apartment, a fistful of fresh thistle and heather obtained with some difficulty, he nearly walked headlong into a waiting Harriet. Oh, hey, he said. These are for you. I wanted to Thanks, they're gorgeous, she cut in, taking the flowers. She gave them a whiff, splashed some water into a pitcher, shoved the stems inside, and turned quickly back to George. Come with me, she said, grabbing his hand. George stumbled behind her, past candlelight and rose petals, noticing that she was in lingerie. When they reached the bedroom, she pushed him onto the bed. George, Harriet asked, do you love me? Of course I do, George answered truthfully. More than anything. Harriet was normally a passionate person, a bon vivant, but she surpassed herself that night. Their lovemaking had an urgency George had never experienced. He lay back contentedly and thought to himself, so, that's make-up sex. About a decade ago, there was a backwards population in the South Pacific that refused to participate in Commission directives. Amazingly, they had their own system of gene enrichment, a collaboration between neighboring island populations, a cute, if primitive, spiritual successor to the directives themselves. Primitives can be loath to give up such traditions. All previous similar situations were resolved through gradual re-education, bolstered with infusions of money. This group, however, was staunchly intransigent. Now, obviously, there can't be two breeding systems running in parallel when you have a goal like global neodiversity. Luckily, the population in question was quite small. The commission was even able to recover some of their genetic material afterwards. Harriet was curled up on the couch next to George, reading a book. This was as good a time as any, he thought, mentally preparing. "Harriet." "Yes, dear," she answered. "I think we ought to meet with Frank and Denise again," said George. "Who?" she said distractedly. "You know, Frank and Denise, the breeding partners we matched with. They got in touch with me last week, wanting to know if we were still interested, and I thought there was no harm in us four getting together again. No pressure, of course, like last time." Harriet didn't immediately answer. She looked to be thinking. "You're still interested in children, right?" George asked, bracing for the response. "I am, yes," she said simply. After a moment, she answered, "Okay, if you'd like to have them over again, we can do that." George, stunned, gave her a kiss. "You're full of surprises," he said. George had been anxious all week, mostly about the chance that Harriet would change her mind. To his delight, she did nothing of the sort, instead approaching the meeting with serene detachment. She picked and prepared things from her garden, which had expanded to the entire backyard. Creeping foliage was menacing adjacent lots, fruits, vegetables, even rows of corn. Their complex didn't allow animals, George had been relieved to learn. The doorbell rang, and the pair were once again welcomed into the apartment. This time Harriet, on her best behavior, engaged in conversations that she normally had no interest in. Frank and Denise responded in kind, showing polite interest in the garden and the small library Harriet had by then curated. Small talk exhausted itself, and the dinner turned to business. "I think," said Denise, "that summer is an ideal season to be born in. We ought to aim for summer babies." "I agree," said Frank, "so we should really get to it. If we can get an appointment to commingle gametes in the next month or so, that puts birth sometime in July." Harriet perked up. "So soon?" she asked. "For summer babies, it would have to be," George pointed out. "Right," the others echoed. "We should reserve a spot now," said Frank. "Most clinics are booked out for about 2 weeks." Brochures materialized, Gen Blend and Hypergen X on the table. "Oh, my," said Harriet worriedly. "I think George and I need to talk this over first." "Are you okay?" George asked. "You look a bit green." Frank and Denise shared a concerned look. "Yes, I'm fine. No, I'm feeling a bit under the weather," Harriet muddled. "Actually, I think maybe we should call it a night." "But we didn't have dessert yet, dear. The strawberries and rhubarb from your garden." "If she's not feeling well, maybe we'd better leave," Frank offered helpfully. "Yes," blurted Harriet. "Here." She got up, stuffed some pie into containers, and giving them to the guests, guided them to the door. George rushed to follow. "Thanks for coming over again. It was so nice to see you. We'll be in touch," George said as Harriet closed the door on the pair. Frank, quietly to Denise, "I'm still waiting on those medical records. She looked a bit ill in there. Looked like she's gaining weight, too." Before George could ask what was going on, Harriet rushed to the bathroom. She was in there for a while. George looked at the food on the counter. "Maybe they're right about homegrown food, Harriet. Has it made you sick like this before?" The bathroom door opened, and Harriet emerged, wash-faced and recovered. "It's not the food, George. Listen, I have something to tell you." George knew that tone. He prepared himself. "I'm pregnant," Harriet said. George was not prepared. "What?" he said. "I knew you weren't too keen on Frank, Harriet, but you could have at least told me that you had picked somebody else." "I didn't pick somebody else, George. It's your baby." George Bergeron had felt a lot of emotions over his 36 years. With a wife like Harriet, likely more than most. But he had never felt anything like what he felt at that moment. Shock, terror, and, astoundingly, joy. The back of his legs met a chair, which he fell into. He must have been moving backwards. There were tears in his eyes. "How?" was all he could say. "I removed my IUD," said Harriet. I know, she needlessly interjected as George was in a state of silent shock. "But just listen, okay? Ever since I fell in love with you, I dreamt of having children together. of us being a family. It was more important to me than anything. When we were denied a joint license, that was the worst day of my life. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't imagine having children with someone else. It makes me sick just to think about it. So I started reading those books about reproductive regulations, case studies of unlicensed breeding, stories of couples fleeing and living off of the grid, and I thought, maybe we could do that. George, still stunned, repeated, "How?" "I have a plan," said Harriet. "That's why I've been practicing so much with the garden. We can have a farm. I got books on raising animals. There's some contraband dealers in the city. They have passports, supplies, guns." "Guns?" George blurted out. "Yes, we'll need them for killing animals, and for protection," Harriet said. "George," she moved closer, "are you okay?" Said George. "How?" "Together," she sat in his lap. "We can do it together, George. Do you still love me?" George's eyes met hers, then moved to her stomach. "Yes," he said. "I love you." The following weeks were very hectic and, for George, surreal. Never in his life had he considered doing something so crazy, and yet here he was, doing it. Twice he had to rebuff a confused Frank and Denise with only the most perfunctory of excuses. Even colleagues noticed a change, though they chalked it up to breeding clinic jitters. Harriet, on the other hand, was in her element, procuring doctored passports, connections with contraband dealers, even the guns. She found some antique pistols and boxes of bullets, the diameter of which was, George read, 9 mm. She was a great comfort to George, who would have bailed 100 times if not for her. Harriet was born for this kind of thing, he thought to himself. And the whole time, her belly was growing. She had to leave her job, and then stop seeing friends and family. They told half of them that she was sick, and the other half that they were moving. "It doesn't matter," Harriet said. "It's just another couple of weeks, and then we'll be gone." Late one morning, there was a knock at the door. George went to answer it, signaling to Harriet to go to the back of the apartment. It was the police, or something like the police. Their badges said, Commission on Neodiversity and Inclusion. "Good morning," one of them said. "We have reason to believe that an unlicensed pregnancy may be present at this address. This is a warrant for genetic testing." The officer showed him a piece of paper. George stood there, dumbfounded. He stammered. I don't know what you mean," he said lamely. The officers pushed past him into the apartment, George rushing to follow. All of them stopped when they encountered a very pregnant Harriet, pistol in hand, aiming squarely at the foremost officer. These men didn't have guns, but armed police weren't far. George's mind was racing. Could they blast their way out of the apartment? The city? What was happening? Was Harriet really going to shoot them? Who ratted them out? They would be arrested. Harriet's pregnancy would be tested and aborted when it was shown to be insufficiently diverse. They would go to prison. It was all over. An officer stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, "put down the weapon." Harriet's thumb pulled back the hammer with a menacing click that made him freeze. Her gun arm steady on the target, the other moved in a protective gesture to her stomach. George had stopped breathing. Time slowed. Harriet, gun still trained on the man in front of her, turned to look at George. She mouthed, "I love you," then brought the gun to her temple. With eyes shut, clutching her stomach, Harriet pulled the trigger. "Harriet, no!" George yelled. Time sped up again. Harriet fell to the floor. The officers rushed forward, one of them with a medical kit. They began working on her, but what could they do? George stared at the body of his wife, waiting for her to look up so that he could tell her that he loved her, too. He waited like that for a long time. Then all of a sudden, they were taking her away. Other men had come into the apartment with a stretcher and more equipment. George managed to ask one of them, "Can you save her?" "No," the man said. "I'm sorry, sir, she's already passed." "Then what are you doing?" asked George. "Trying to save the baby," he said. "We're taking them into surgery to remove the fetus and get it into incubation." The baby, George thought. George Bergeron stepped out into a bright April afternoon that seemed hopeful about summer. Today was the day that he could take his baby boy home from the hospital, after 2 long months of incubation. He had gone every day to see him. Looking through the glass, he watched his son fidget and grow, and searched for Harriet in those tiny, precious features. Last night, he had finally screwed up the courage to go through Harriet's things, those left by the police. Her library was mostly intact, with some of her papers and plans for their new life. Stuffed in one of her books on parenting, like a bookmark, he found a folded piece of paper. It had his name on it. He took it out, unfolded it. It was a letter from Harriet. He read it slowly. George, my dearest George, if you're reading this letter, something has gone horribly wrong. Maybe I'm in jail, and our baby is gone. Maybe I'm not alive. If it comes to a choice between the two, I will choose the latter. Do you remember that case I read to you about the pregnant woman who died? They saved the baby, even though it was unlicensed. George, I love you more than I've ever loved anyone. But love, our love, does not exist only for itself. It exists to make new love, new life. I pray that you understand, and that you forgive me for leaving you. Please tell our child that I love them more than anything, and that I'm so sorry I'm not there. Tell them that I'll always be with them, in their heart. We never did get around to names, did we? I was thinking maybe Georgette for a girl, and for a boy, Harrison, but I'll leave it to you. I love you both more than you can know. Harriet. George continued to walk. Around him sprawled the city, the architecture, the food, the music, the people. He could be in any city on earth. Seeing the diversity before him, George wiped away a tear.